We have a funny history lesson today, and one that really surprised me because all matters of sexuality have been very taboo in the Middle Ages. At least, what have you been led to believe? But things are very much different than common belief because there's some myths, some legends, and what is the truth? And we're going to find out today. So let's say that there is so much to say about this topic that it's really hard to know where to start. Honestly, I'm not even sure I put together a clear path, but I'll do my best to hit the key points. And above all, we'll try to show how the things that we can say about the sexual life in the Middle Ages are connected to specific information that comes from that era. We're able to say something about this topic because medieval literature talks about it, but also because medieval jurists, canonists, and physicians discuss it. The information comes from different directions and different sources. They're all converging to tell us essentially one thing. And I also think that it's important to challenge a common misconception. Medieval society wasn't as highly repressed as many people believe. It's only toward the end of the Middle Ages that we start to see a real push from the clergy and especially from governments to tighten control and punish nonconformity and enforce stricter models of behavior. Before that, there was actually a significant degree of freedom in both behavior and language. Much more that we will see later periods like in the Renaissance, the modern era, or even in some ways today when it comes to language. So the aspects of the Middle Age taboos can challenge today's modern language in the wide range of colorful ideas regarding sexuality. So given that wide range of sources available, I'll be drawing heavily from the literature. And some may argue, but how can we trust literature? And how do we know that literature truly reflects real-life behavior? Well, in fact, legal sources confirm much of what we find in literature to both provide an insight into a society where sex was viewed as a natural part of life and it was openly acknowledged and discussed with notable freedom. This was true for both men and women, showing that conversation around sexual behavior weren't as restricted or taboo as we might assume today. To introduce the topic, let me share a story from Boccaccio. So Boccaccio is recounts one of those tales that unsurprisingly isn't part of the school curriculum. You might find out why. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron. The Decameron is a collection of 100 short stories written by Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio between 1349 and 1353. Now, I'm talking about documentation and stories that are mostly recounted throughout Europe and throughout Italy and France, because I think those were the parts where the Middle Ages really had their maximum expression. Also, we can find Middle Age throughout whole Europe. So the Giovanni Boccaccio Decameron was set against the grim backdrop of Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century. The book begins with a framed story. 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, flee the plague-stricken Florence and retreat to a villa in the countryside. To pass the time, they agree to tell stories, and with each person sharing one tale per day for 10 days. And this results in 100 stories overall. These stories span a wide range of themes from love, tragedy, comedy, wit, practical jokes, and life lessons. The Decameron is renowned for its vivid portrayal of medieval life, its exploration of human nature, and of course its humor, which at times can be both earthly and explicit. As a masterpiece of classical Italian prose, it has left a lasting impact on literature and storytelling throughout the Western world. Boccaccio's work is celebrated for its exploration of humanistic themes and its insightful reflection of complexities of human behavior and its challenge of the social and moral norms of his era. In Boccaccio, in the Decameron, we find the story of Pietro di Vinculo. It takes place in Perugia, in the region, and not too long ago. A wealthy man named Pietro di Vinculo, this is the last story of the fifth day of the Decameron. Pietro di Vinculo, as Boccaccio says, got married not because he wanted to, but he tried to put on a front to contradict what everyone in Perugia was saying about him, which was indeed true. He did not like women. And so it happened that he married a young woman, Boccaccio says, with a fiery red complexion, who would have preferred two husbands rather than one. The redhead soon realizes that Pietro is not interested in her and leaves her alone in bed. When she realizes this, she gets angry, and she says, "If I hadn't believed he was a man, I would never have married him." Thinking of herself, she reasons that at this point she is justified in taking lovers. After all, legally and technically, her husband is doing much worse. "I can break the law by bringing in lovers, since he's not only breaking the law, but also nature. If I wanted to give up worldly pleasures, I would have become a nun, but instead, I don't want to give up anything." That's what she says. So the redhead begins to have affairs. Then, as always, what always happens in these tales, as you might imagine, happens one fine evening while her husband is away on business. She invites a handsome young man over. The husband returns unexpectedly. And these are the kinds of situations that are ideal for a storyteller. And they lend themselves to many different solutions. In medieval literature, starting from this scenario, the betrayed husband who comes home unexpectedly and finds someone he did not want to find. This can lead to countless developments. For example, in the fabliaux, which are short, comic, and erotic French poems from the 1200s, they're older than Boccaccio. It's a different kind of literature. They're very similar stories that are all told to those found in the most risque tales of the Decameron. They're similar, but they're a little bit more risque, more taboo. In the fabliaux, the story often goes like this. The lover who has come to visit the lady in the absence of her husband is a priest. Priests are notoriously great seducers of their parishioners. They are people who know how to speak and have means, so they seduce easily. In the fabliaux titled The Dyed Priest, a comical scene unfolds. The priest, who has brought fine wine and a goose to share with his beloved for dinner, is caught by the returning husband. Now the priest needs to hide quickly. The husband is a dyer. They dye statues, and his workshop contains a large vat, a container. The wife, thinking fast, tells the priest, "Hide in there." The priest dives in the vat, which is filled with red dye, and remains submerged. After a while, the husband starts to notice his wife's odd behavior and becomes suspicious. He finally decides to investigate and peeks into the workshop, wondering what's going on. But prior to that, they dinner together, they eat the goose, they drink the wine that the priest brought. So once the husband becomes suspicious, he figures out what's happening. He plays it cool and pretends to notice nothing. After he and his wife have enjoyed their meal and drinks, he says, "Oh, now I need to check on something in the workshop. I put a crucifix to soak in the dye, and I want to see if it's taken the color well." He heads up to the workshop and uncovers the vat, the container. The priest, realizing he's been discovered, stays perfectly still like a crucifix, like this. Then the dyer calls the servants to pull the priest out, the statue, and examine him, and finds that he's indeed well dyed. They leave him standing there to dry, and he's still standing like this, like a cross. But the story continues. He was standing there naked. It's hot, and after a while, something begins to move and stir up. So the dyer, still pretending not to notice, looks and says, well, when has anyone ever seen," the French text says, When everyone has ever seen a crucifix with a penis sticking up at the sculptor? He must have been drunk. And a story of this kind is found even earlier in a text that is of Western European Christian origins, but describes the behaviors of those strange people who are indeed European Christians. We'll come back to that story later, I think. It is found in an Arabic text of the early 12th century, during the time of the Crusades. The author is Usama ibn Munkid. He is an emir of the Shaizar in Palestine, an Arab prince who spent his life fighting the Crusaders, or rather he fought them in times of war and truce, and conducted business with them, visited them, and discussed with them. So he's a first-hand testimony. So he came to know their world, and then in his memoirs, he recounts to his Islamic audience what a strange people these Franks are, people from Francia, from France, as they called them, these Christians from Europe, and how they are. Usama recounts, among other things, that these Franks are people who have no concept of honor, and one only needs to see how they behave with their wives to understand they do not know what jealousy is. Usama, for example, says that a Frank can easily go out in the street with his wife, then meet a friend and start chatting. If things go on for a while and the husband has other matters to attend to, he goes off and to take care of his business and leaves his wife standing in the street talking to someone else. What does Usama say to his audience? That it is inconceivable, unheard of. Then Usama continues saying, you don't know what can happen among these people who have no sense of honor. He recounts an incident involving a merchant, describing him as if he had known him, a wine merchant from one of these Crusade cities on the coast of the Holy Land. So one day the merchant returns home and finds his wife in bed with another man. The merchant confronts the intruder, asking, what are you doing in that bed? The intruder replies, what do you want? I was very tired, and I asked if I could rest for a while. But excuse me, is this woman his wife? Telling to the man. And she's sleeping in bed with you? The intruder responds. But it's her bed. I couldn't stop her from using it as well. At this point, Usama says, the merchant remarked, by my faith, if you do this again, we will have a fight. Telling him to his wife. Well, this is what Usama says, revealing their jealousy and sense of honor. Now, as you can see from this starting point, many conclusions can be drawn. What is the conclusion of Boccaccio's novella? The conclusion is that Pietro da Vincolo, upon arriving and finding his wife all agitated and worried due to strange noises, goes to investigate and discovers the lover hiding. At this point, Pietro da Vincolo sees that the lover is a young man whom he himself was very interested in, someone he had been pursuing for a while without success. So he says, no, calm down, I won't do anything to you. He takes the man by the hand, goes to his wife and says, what's going on here? At this point, the wife tells him bluntly that he has little room to complain, because since he, the husband, is not attending to her needs, she has every right to handle things herself and intends to. Pietro, I am a woman, just like the others, and I desire what the others desire. I want what all other women want. This is a very unusual story. Because the protagonist is quite unique. Instead of continuing with the scene, Pietro says to his wife, all right, let's not argue. Have you already had dinner? Since they haven't had dinner yet, they all three sit down at the table. Then Boccaccio says, Pietro must have found a way to resolve the situation to the satisfaction of all three. And I can't recall what exactly he thought, but I do know that the next morning, the young man was escorted back to the square, and he himself would no longer have been able to clearly say whether he had been the husband or the wife that night. So this is a novella. And of course, a novella, it's a piece of Italian literature that can refer to a short and often a humorous, satirical tale or an anecdote. But from a story like this, what we can draw, it's a series of conclusions that are generally inconsistent with the image of a particular repressive era, the Middle Ages. At the very least, it is an era where sex is discussed with great freedom. But sex is not merely seen as something diabolical or evil. No, sex is part of nature, something that everyone, both men and women, needs. And it is a part of life and a right. Now, the fact that this right extends to women is worth emphasizing, as another common belief about the Middle Ages is that it was a misogynistic period. It is clearly that it was a patriarchal and male-dominated society from any perspective, but misogynistic would be a little bit something else entirely. The conjugal duty is a legal obligation for both the husband and the wife, and if it is not fulfilled, it can be grounds for requesting a separation. Furthermore, deviant behaviors are repressed indeed. Pietro da Vinculo is a homosexual. Everyone knows how Boccaccio portrays him, but Boccaccio is not interested in representing something completely unrealistic. He depicts a wealthy and respected man who is openly homosexual, and nothing happens to him at all. And this is an important lesson, not because laws against homosexuality do not exist, but because we have a strong evidence that until the end of the Middle Ages, these laws were rarely enforced. In fact, someone will have to draw serious attention to themselves to be caught. So it's a mistake to think that just because a behavior is legally forbidden, it doesn't occur. For example, assuming that political corruption doesn't exist today simply because it's illegal. Another common cliché is the belief that the clergy was universally misogynistic and sex-phobic. The issue here is that we often struggle to distinguish between different types of religious figures, whether they were monks, friars, priests, or even clerics, who could have been married. For instance, it's worth noting that Boccaccio himself was a priest. So that's a very important connotation, because if Boccaccio himself was a priest, he actually was the one writing these novellas and these stories. And within the clergy, there were always monks who, if they were devout, remained secluded in their monasteries. They practiced chastity and believed that any erotic dreams were temptations sent by the devil. However, throughout much of the Middle Ages, priests and clerics who interacted with the public often married, simply. It wasn't until the 11th century that a rule was introduced, in theory, prohibiting priests from marrying. Even then, clerics of the lower orders could still marry freely, while priests were officially barred from marriage until the 11th century. It seems like these prohibitions were more about outward appearances than a strict enforcement. And it wasn't until the modern era, during the Counter-Reformation, that a serious effort was made to prevent priests and parish priests from living with women. But in the centuries of the late Middle Ages, there is a strong sense that it was quite common for priests to live with a woman. They simply could no longer call her their wife. The children were no longer considered legitimate, and if the bishop came around wanting to cause trouble, if a bishop, he could use that pretext to stir up some problems with somebody else. However, people were accustomed to the fact that priests had relationships and natural children, and this didn't really affect their opinion on the priest, on their nature. So a good bishop was distinguished by other qualities. I think of a chronicle like Salimbene da Parma, a Franciscan friar from the 1200s, who was an absolute orthodox. He belonged to the ruling class by birth, and he was an important friar, a scholar, very learned, and had personally met emperors and popes. In his lifetime, he met many bishops and had very clear ideas about which bishops were decent people and which were scoundrels. The scoundrels were those who were greedy, who did not know to properly host people, and who kept their wealth from themselves, or who were ignorant. Other aspects were considered secondary. One of the bishops Salimbene admires most of is Filippo da Pistoia. the archbishops of Ravenna, whom he describes as an entirely positive character. So when the Archbishop of Ravenna invites people to lunch, there is plenty of good food and drink for everyone. Even those seated at the back, receive the best wines. Not like some bishops who keep the good wine for themselves and give the poor quality wine to their guests. As Salimbene says, as if all throats did not thirst in the same way. Beyond this, Filippo da Pistoia, the Archbishop of Ravenna, is a great bishop, a skilled and seasoned politician, a strong defender of his church, and a true gentleman. Of course, to be fair, he also has his weaknesses. He loves his nephews so much that it seems like if you want to obtain something from him, all you need to do is to come to an agreement with his nephews or just slip them a bribe. But that is understandable, especially since one of those nephews was his own son. So it's easy to see why the archbishop was so fond of him. Salimbene also mentions that he had a daughter who was a nun, though we do not know in which monastery, and I was her confessor at one point, says Salimbene. She didn't know who her father was, although, of course, everyone else did. This is, after all, a society in which making fun of womanizing, flirtatious, and fornicating priests and bishops are normal. Perhaps because these same bishops and priests were trying to impose a certain standard of rigor to ordinary folks or ordinary believers, so did not push things too far. So among these French fabliaux, as I mentioned earlier, these poems from the 13th and the early 14th century, I found myself immediately in trouble because these French authors were not afraid of using bad words, slurs. Given our own hypocrisy, I'm sure quoting the title in Old French would be less shocking than translating it. The story is about the bishop who blessed the female genitalia, let's say the P, okay? However, I want to pause for a moment on this fact. In Boccaccio, there are no swear words. Boccaccio in the 14th century in pre-humanist Italy tells incredibly scandalous stories without holding back, but he never uses explicit language. He always uses paraphrases and circumlocutions. There's a long and difficult word. For example, in the story of Donna Gianni, he says, "She raised her skirt and took the tool with which she planted man and quickly set into the furrow made for that purpose." Or in the case of Gianni Lotteringhi's wife, who was also waiting for her lover, but her husband came home early. Luckily, the lover had not yet arrived, but how to inform him? The husband wants to go to bed. They are already in bed, and it's time for the lover to arrive. The lover comes and knocks softly at the door. The husband asks, "What's going on?" And the wife says, "I think it must be a ghost, a ghost. But I know a spell to drive ghosts away." And so the wife, loud enough for the lover outside to hear, begins to chant, "Ghost, ghost, that walks by night. With the long tail you came, and with a straight tail you shall leave." So this is very hilarious. Yet there are no swear words. But the French authors of the previous century had no such scruples. They would just give it to us in a raw language. This story is about the bishop who blessed the P, okay? As the matter was that this bishop loved the company of ladies. He also liked girls and had no trouble finding beautiful ones. He paid them well and always had some at his disposal, ready to do whatever he wanted. Because, let's face it, they only care about money. That's what he said. And only if you can pay a lot, you can forget about having any luck with women. Then the bishop has, among his priests, a vicar who lives openly with his concubine, but he is getting a bit too much attention. So the bishop, fulfilling his official duties, tries in every way to force him to give up his woman. issuing a whole series of burlesque prohibition. So he calls him, summons him, and says, "Enough with the story, Your Grace. I cannot possibly do that." The vicar replies, "Look, if you continue to stay with that woman, I will forbid you from drinking wine for the rest of your life." The vicar goes home in despair and says to his loved one, "Well, can't you drink wine through a straw?" He didn't say anything about that. And so it goes on like this for a while, but in the end, feeling persecuted, the vicar decides on a counterattack, on a counterplan. He's on good terms with a noble woman in the area who is known to be the bishop's lover. He goes to her and says, "Madam, you must help me, please, because my bishop is really persecuting me." The noble woman finds it amusing and agrees, saying, "All right, let's do it. The next time the bishop comes to visit me, you come and I'll hide you behind the bed curtains." The bishop arrives, wine, dinner, spices, and then it's time for bed. The bishop undresses, all excited, and then he's already eager, and the lady says, "Oh, Your Grace, if you want to enjoy my pee, you must first bless it and make the sign of the cross. Otherwise, it is not consecrated, and you cannot touch it." So the bishop, always mindful of such things, agrees. "All right, madam, whatever you want. Yes, we can do that. And even if it means too much for you, it costs me nothing. I'll do it." So he tells her, like, it costs me nothing. Like, it's something that is, it's something little for him to do. So he raises his hand and makes the sign of the cross over her pee and begins to recite, "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." And then again, "In saecula saeculorum." And the priests hiding behind the curtains respond, "Amen," with all the rest. As you can imagine, in the end, the bishop gives up and says, "All right, do whatever you want, just never come before me," to his vicar. "Never come before me again. Deal with it yourself." So this reminds me of a show that I was watching once. It's called Poldark. There is this vicar called Whitworth, which he's a religious man, and he has a fascination with women's feet. So this guy is highly, highly promiscuous with people. And this is something coming from during the 18th century, the Victorian era. So that's something that really made me remember that. And he always would say to his wife, "Wife, you need to fulfill your conjugal duties." So that's something that really makes me laugh every time I think about. So here we can clearly see the double standard at play. The church has the duty to teach Christians proper behavior. So it sets up a series of rules and norms. Yet at the same time, there is an expectation that even the clergy will struggle to fully adhere to these standards. But these rules weren't imposed blindly or randomly, nor they were driven by a repressive impulse, sadism, or some delusional need for control. The key point is that the medieval clergy was largely made up of intelligent, educated individuals, people accustomed to reading, reflecting, and reasoning. Their role was to teach Christians how to live in all aspects of life. There wasn't an obsession with sexual matters, but since sexual life is a natural part of existence, it was something the clergy had to address as well. Those responsible for creating rules, such as the canonists who set guidelines for confessors, were clearly trying to understand what Christians needed to be taught in this area. If you read these works, you can see a clear effort to be systematic, anticipating various situations, and categorizing them. This is serious, this is more serious, well, that. So it's a serious topic for them to discuss these things. But let me give you an example to clarify. Uguccione da Pisa, a 12th century canonist, raises an interesting question in his writings. It is permissible to have sex solely for the purpose of giving pleasure to one's wife? At first glance, you may think, no, surely the purpose is procreation. Then, when it comes to menstruation, various medieval treatises held some fascinating and rather superstitious views and beliefs. They claimed that menstruation could prevent grain from germinating, sour grape must, upon contact, cause grass to wither, plants to lose their fruit, iron to rust, and even make dogs rabid if they consumed it. Here you might say, finally, there is superstitions in the Middle Ages. After all, it's true that those were dark centuries. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but all these things medieval authors read in Pliny the Younger, which was a scientific treatise from antiquity that had transmitted all these ideas to scholars of the Middle Ages. Now, Pliny the Younger was a Roman lawyer, author, and magistrate, best known for his letters which provide a valuable historical account of Roman life during the 1st century AD. And on the opposite end of the scientific thought, there were practical actions, such as spells and magic used for abortion, or even to prevent conception. This was very common in a world filled with people who were married but still engaged in sexual relationships, where various forms of relationships existed, and were living together without marriage, and was also quite normal. So judicial sources frequently note when someone is living with a partner. In a world where not having children would be a significant issue, solutions were explored. And a particularly intriguing case arises from the early 14th century in the Pyrenees, that would be in the French mountains, during a major inquisitorial trial in an area known for its heretics. A keen and perceptive inquisitor conducted extensive interrogations on the local mountain people, asking questions that seemed unrelated to the pursuit of heretics. However, his inquiries were likely aimed at reconstructing the local social and cultural landscape, as these details ultimately proved valuable to his investigation. From the records of these inquisitorial interrogations, the renowned historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie wrote the famous book Montaillou, Village Occitan, History of a Village. In this village of Montaillou, the dominant figure is the parish priest, Pierre Clergy, and he's larger-than-life character, engaging. He has numerous affairs with village women, wielding considerable influence, and coming from a wealthy family. His brother is the local bailiff, the chief official of the area. With his charm, eloquence, and wealth, Clergy effectively does as he pleases in the village. One notable affair involves the only noblewoman in Montaillou. The village has a castle where a castellan and an official resides, and his wife, Beatrice de Planisot, is the sole noblewoman in the village, and she too has an affair with the priest. When questioned about this, she admits, "Yes, I did an affair with the priest, but we agreed to avoid having children." And I make a French accent. And he had a remedy for that. When Pierre Clergy wanted to know me carnally, he brought an herb wrapped in linen cloth about the size of the first phalanx of the little finger, and he had a long thread that passed around my neck while he were making love. This thing with the herb, with the herb at the end of the thread could hang down between my breasts and all the way down to my navel. Here we have a stark contrast to Mondino de Liuzzi, who dissected corpses to examine the sides of the uterus. These two approaches, practical and scientific versus the more personal and experiential, coexisted in the same period. What this reveals is that sexuality was considered a universal aspect of life, with few major taboos surrounding it. As I mentioned regarding swear words, let's take a moment to explore this further. In the French fabliaux of the 1200s, terms like the P for the man and the V for the woman were used with remarkable freedom, words that by the 1300s even Boccaccio would have avoided. Tastes and standards were evolving after all. But in the 13th century France, swear words were certainly known and recognized as vulgar. The difference was that they were widely used. So what does this tell us? French literature from that time includes a range of texts that explore this very issue. Swear words were often considered a male domain, and respectable women were expected to avoid using them. Take, for example, the fabliaux of the squirrel. In it, a wealthy bourgeois woman advises her 14-year-old daughter, saying, "Be careful, as you are now a woman. At 14, girls are ready for marriage." Different times. "Having reached their first menstruation, you are a young lady now and must behave accordingly, not like a wild child." Women were expected to adhere to certain rules, such as wearing a veil. Once married in the Middle Ages, a woman should no longer be seen by strangers without a veil, not covering her face, but her hair, of course. And the mother, who is from a good family, explains to her daughter that she must be very careful not to use certain words. "What words, mother?" the child says. "You must never name that thing that men have." "What thing do men have, mother?" "Yes, that thing that hangs in front of them. That thing that even your father has, which dangles between his legs." "But what it's called, mother?" "It must have a name." "A fish?" "No, daughter, is not a fish." "A rod?" "No, daughter, it's not a rod." Finally, the mother allows herself to be baited into saying the word in Old French that means levit, V-I-T, that means penis. It's a very old form. But then the daughter says, "But I hear my brother saying it all the time and every moment. And the maid says it all the time. I want to say it too. And I'll give myself permission to do so." Levit is a vulgar term used in medieval literature and is one of the examples of explicit language used in certain texts of the time, like the fabliaux. Why are swear words considered swear words? Why shouldn't women use them? Is it right? Does it make sense? Or is it nonsense? This is addressed in the most popular book of the entire French Middle Ages, Le Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose. I'm talking about a vast novel that was extremely popular at the time, the biggest bestseller of its era, translated immediately into all languages. In Italy, it was translated almost right away into a series of sonnets called Il Fiore, the flower, which could also maybe be attributed to Dante Alighieri, the writer of the Divine Comedy. In Le Roman de la Rose, the most famous and popular book of its time, there is a noteworthy discussion about swear words. The narrative features a dialogue between the protagonist, an ardent lover, whose sole desire is to pick the rose, which is the essence in the story's title. The Romance of the Rose, and various characters, including Reason, who is portrayed as a woman embodying values esteemed by medieval intellectuals. Before the rose is finally picked, the protagonist faces numerous challenges and engages in extensive debates on various topics, including scientific matters. The book describes in elaborate details the protagonist's quest and eventual triumph of picking the rose, reflecting both the difficulties faced and the intellectual inquiries that shaped the journey. Reason is depicted as one of God's greatest gifts. The world was made by nature in obedience to the rules of reason guiding the world. As Reason engages in conversation with the protagonist, she uses the word with V, the privates, female privates, in its plural form, referring to the female genitalia. The lover, the male protagonist, is taken aback and responds with shock, saying, "You mentioned the term V, which is highly inappropriate for the mouth of a well-educated lady. If such topics must be discussed," he adds, "one should use the gentle terms employed by the nurses, who use sweet little nicknames to refer to that thing." Reason gets irritated and begins to argue. "So, these words should not be used according to you. But look, if we all agree that everything has its own name, and that name should be used, then talking about that thing, the lover replies, yes, but these things are not nice things. Reason that says to him, excuse me, but who do you think created the V? God created them. And he created them with a specific purpose. They serve to do something very important. Therefore, I called them by their name, without needing comments or modesty. I called them by their name, those noble things that my Father in heaven once made with his own hands. This time, the male protagonist tries to recover and says, yes, okay, of course. Those things themselves are noble. Undoubtedly, they were created by God. They are noble. It is the word that is ignoble. The word is shameful, tells him. Oh, so you think the thing himself is noble, but the word is shameful. Do you know where the word comes from? The lover replies. No, the word was invented at some point, but it has nothing to do with the object. We decided to call it that. So, on this basis alone, you say the word is shameful. In itself, the word be is not shameful at all. Imagine, reason says, they had made an opposite choice, that they had decided to call the female genitalia relics, and the V, that to refer to our V, they had chosen the word relics. Then reason continues, you who now reproach me would have considered the word relics ugly and vulgar, while the word V would be wonderful word, and you will be ready to kiss them in their golden and silver shrines. So reason goes even further and says it's absurd that these words are considered scandalous, and it's doubly absurd that it's only women who make such a fuss about it. Women should also stop the silly habit of referring to these things as purses, tools, things, or pine cones. Reason lists all sorts of synonyms and concludes, call them by their name, please. So as you can see here, the Middle Age is a bit more complex than the stereotypes we sometimes have in mind. We have these dark ages where people would just work all day and go to bed, pray at night. The next day will be the same thing. We have this idea of this peasant mentality and this clergy that stood on top with the nobles to dictate to people how to live their lives. There is this terms by monks that would say, ora et labora, pray and work. And in order for them to guarantee a spot in heaven, to live a pious life and to sacrifice their actual life for an intangible heaven that who knows. And the idea was also to create compliance in people and to scare the believer at the same time. But what we're seeing here is that the Middle Ages was an age that was far from repressive, with priests and common people engaging openly in adultery and different ways of sexual freedom and liberty, both men and women. So this is something that is really in stark contrast with our ideas of how we thought about the past. One thing that strikes as a contrast to me is how the beautification and the deification of the female figure from the chivalry that you had at the time, where women were showered with compliments and with prose and poetry. So there was a different element than what we have today. Well, of course, you had a repressed position of women in a high patriarchal society, but that doesn't make it misogynistic under all points of view, because as we've seen, there was an equal eagerness to discuss sexual matters and even to practice them, and also a certain independence under certain points of view. Even because I believe that if you were a noble, born and raised in a noble house as a woman, you had it much better than a male peasant breaking his back in the fields. Still, with restrictive choices and arranged marriages, we can easily say that it was indeed a repressive time for the female gender. But in an age where, as we've seen, they could marry at 14, that was a different time and a crazy time. So I hope you were entertained for this little time that we spent together. If you find this amusing, give it a like and a thumbs up, and maybe consider subscribing. It took a lot of work, and I had a lot of fun creating this episode here. Well, this will be all for this episode here, and I will see you next time. Bye.